principles, philosophy, esoteric elements. So, Brother Bob, welcome. Thank you for this time.
Good evening, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to thank everyone who was online on Wednesday, 2 days ago. The reason for that is that so many very interesting questions were asked that I had to go away and do a little bit of research, and for which I'm extremely grateful, because it's always a good idea to refresh your memory about a variety of things. And actually tonight, I'm going to be emphasizing again the role of William Shaw, but more importantly this time, not so much about the individual, but about what he was trying to do with these old lodges in Scotland. So again, I'm going to follow a kind of chronology from the earliest of these minutes, and we'll probably get up to 1717 thereabouts. There is another section that I think would be very interesting to everyone, where I talk about the formation of the Grand Lodge of Scotland in 1736, what was happening immediately before that in England, and what happened after that, primarily what happened in Scotland. And then how Scotland then took away from the kind of local organisation, and it became an international organisation. Let me just put that off. Put it off. It became an international organisation in the 18th century. And one of the most important things I think everyone should bear in mind is that Scotland was and is a very small country, geographically, very small. The population is very small. Even today, the population is just over 5 million. In the period that we're discussing, the early period that we're discussing, the population would be less than 1 million, much less than 1 million. No accurate records, of course, for that long ago. So what I'm getting at is that this is a very small country, and it clearly meant that the message that this small country had really struck a nerve with people who were looking at Scotland and looking what it was doing. As well as the Masonic side of things, there was a great deal of esoteric research taking place here in the 16th and 17th centuries, and I'll touch on that a little bit. And this wasn't connected with Freemasonry as such, although, and the reason for that was that it was mainly an aristocratic pastime. But of course, the aristocrats were involved in the lodges, and so there was some overlap. But in the main, it was an aristocratic pastime that we're only now beginning to understand, mainly from the libraries that these aristocrats had, and which are now, sadly, were placed in the National Archive and still have not yet been catalogued. So it's a real treasure trove, I think, waiting to be discovered. Anyway, because of the questions last Wednesday, I'm going to return to the Shaw statutes, because I think a lot springs from that. And let me just read you, and this is why refreshing your memory is very good. You'll remember I was discussing the Shaw statutes along the lines of, when you read them, they tend to be, in many people's opinion, health and safety regulations. They talk about all sorts of things like keeping scaffolding secure and all that kind of stuff. But throughout the text, there's a very strong moral overtone to it. And let me just, I'm going to read this one, because this is very important in the sense that it's the very first statute. And as I say, bear in mind that most people think that these are health and safety regulations, actual working practices. And this is the very first statute from the Shaw Statute of 1598. and I'll translate it. It's written in what we call Middle Scots, but I'll translate it into modern English. And the first item, the first statute from 1590 is, and remember, these are addressed to every lodge in Scotland. Item first, that they observe and keep all the good ordinances set down of before concerning the privileges of their craft by their predecessors of good memory, and especially that they be true to one another, live charitably together, as become sworn brethren and companions of craft. No health and safety dimension in that opening statement of the First Shaw Statute. There is no health and safety dimension whatsoever. This is a direct instruction from the Master of Works to every single lodge, saying that they, and we can take this to two sentences, we can take it to bits and understand just what it is that William Shaw is actually instructing these lodges to do. The first part is that they observe and keep all the good ordinances. So, in other words, all the true and correct rules that were set down by concerning the privileges of the craft, set down by their predecessors of good memory. So, in other words, predecessors had already set down some rules and regulations for the conduct of the craft. So in 1598, William Shaw already knows that something previously existed that he wanted the lodges to preserve. So unfortunately, he's telling them to do it. He's not telling us what they were. But clearly, this was an incredibly important thing as far as Shaw was concerned, because he wanted the lodges to make sure that they looked after each other, that they obeyed the rules that had been in existence before he came along. And this, remember, these would be oral instructions. But then for me, the second sentence is even more important, whereby he says that they be true to one another, live charitably together, as becomes sworn brethren and companions of the craft. So in other words, let's take that part a little bit, that they be true to one another. In other words, they look after each other, they don't tell lies about each other, and they live charitably together. That they allow people, it's to reduce the friction. Everyone has got to look as at each other. Today we would call it in terms of brotherly love. But the very final part is very interesting as well, because, I mean, he says, as becomes sworn brethren and companions of the craft. So in other words, they have taken an oath. They have sworn to do this. So all these people in these lodges had already existing regulations. They were moral obligations. They were not health and safety. They were moral obligations as to how to live with each other. So this was the first and most important instruction, as far as Shaw was concerned, that they were to behave like Freemasons, in my opinion. But he's telling them, you've got something special here. You're brothers together. You look after each other. You obey the regulations that you've always had. And unfortunately, of course, we never know when these regulations and moral precepts were written down. But for me, it's also very, very important that first and foremost in these statutes, we now know that they took an oath, sworn brethren. So they had already taken an oath to behave kindly to one another, to live charitably together. And that, for me, shows that before Shaw comes along, there is something very similar to what we would find familiar in many ways was already taking place in these lodges. And he sees the value of the way these lodges were doing things, and he's telling them, this is what you've got to preserve. And then, of course, as we discussed on Wednesday, he goes back to talk about how you need to keep written records, how you've got to start memorizing things, because he sees there's a value to all this. And he wants the lodges, illiterate members, he wants the illiterate members to learn how to memorize all this important stuff that was already in existence before he comes along. Now, I left a little clue on Wednesday, but nobody actually picked me up on it. So we'll discuss that now, and it's also in relation to the Shaw statutes. If Shaw is writing this to the lodges, how did he know what it was that was important to be preserved? So this is stuff that's secret. It's only the people in these stonemasons' lodges that possess that knowledge. Yet he is telling them, you will preserve it. This is how you're to live, act, look after each other, because you have sworn an oath. How does he know what it is that he's telling them to remember and to do? Well, the clue's in the date. The date is the date of the document. And both the statutes from 1598 and 1599 are dated the 27th of December, both of them. Now, what's again is important, this is where Scotland is different as usual, because we're talking about Scotland. You've got to remember, Scotland is a bit of a different place from many other parts of the world. But even today, the installation of Masonic lodges, certainly the old ones, all attempt to have their installation, that is the installation of the new master of the lodge, to be installed on the 27th of December every year. This documents are dated the 28th. So explain why in a minute, but I need to explain the importance of the 27th of December. What happened in Scotland was that in 1475, and I'm sorry I keep throwing old dates at you, but in 1475, the Masons of Edinburgh, the stonemasons of Edinburgh, were recognized as being an incorporation or a guild. We call them incorporations in Scotland, but they're essentially very similar to the guild, but it's an incorporation. So in 1475, they're granted what we called a seal of cause. And essentially what this is the city, the town council, give them a charter. They give them a charter to be a guild of stonemasons. Now, this is before the Reformation, a long time before the Reformation. So virtually every aspect of daily life had a religious element to it. And in the seal of cause or the charter of 1475, the religious aspect is addressed by the city council. And in it, they say that you will, according to what the church requires, the Roman Catholic Church requires, you are now, so, sorry, let me explain. The charter lays out rights and responsibilities of the stonemasons as a guild, okay? The main right that the stonemasons acquire from this charter is they get a political voice on the city council. So they get a say in the way the city is run. But there's also duties and responsibilities that come with that privilege of having a voice, a political voice. One of them is that they are directed in this charter. And remember, the Scots just love to write all this stuff down, so that nobody could come back and challenge what was being said. So this is why these documents are very important. If it was written down, it was important. If it was important, it was written down. So this seal of cause, this charter says that all sorts of other things, all sorts of other responsibilities of the guild is that they've to look after the wages of the workers. They're not allowed to have rampant wage inflation. They've to look after the moral character of all their members. And to reinforce that, they are told that they are now responsible for the Isle of St. John the Evangelist in the cathedral, the Edinburgh main cathedral in Edinburgh, which still exists. And the Isle of St. John the Evangelist was theirs to look after. They had to maintain it, keep it in good repair. They had to supply candle wax for the Mass, and they had to actually pay the priest to say the Mass for the deceased stonemasons. So why is this important? Well, this becomes the most important religious day for the stonemasons of Scotland. The 27th of December is when they all get together in the Isle of St. John the Evangelist, and we know this because they record the fact that they are having their meeting. So they meet on the 27th of December where they settle all the business of the year. They record the admission of new members of the guild, but one has to suspect perhaps the lodge also. But they have, so they record and they pay the bills that have accumulated over the year, etc., etc. So the 27th of December becomes the most important day of the year for stonemasons, whether they're in the guild or in the lodge. So what we find is that when we come to the lodge, they are using the 27th of December as well for their annual general meeting, and one assumed the installation of their new master or new office bearers or whatever. So the 27th of December is the patron saint of Masons in Scotland. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated, because when Masonry moved from Scotland to England, they, and again, we know this from the records, they said, well, okay, so St. John is the patron saint of the Masons. And let me just put this off, it's a bit distracting. So St. John is the patron saint of the Masons. And then someone said, well, which St. John? And of course, you've got two, St. John the Evangelist, 27th of December, or St. John the Baptist, the 24th of June. Now, which saint are you going to choose as your patron saint? The one who has his feast day in the depth of winter when it's dark and wet and cold and no one can work? Or are you going to choose the 24th of June when it's nice and bright and sunny and everyone's on holiday and having a great time at the beach? Which date are you going to choose? Which one are you going to choose for your most important day of the year? Well, of course, there's no argument, isn't it? It's going to be 24th of June. And that's why we end up, I think, with St. John the Baptist Day as being an important day in the Masonic calendar. But it's not important in Scotland. 24th of June carries no weight in Scotland. Nothing happens on the 24th of June here, except for one errant lodge. And of course, we're talking about Scotland, so you have to forgive them. So the 27th of December is the most important day, okay? Now, the Shaw Statutes are signed on the 28th of December, the very next day. So William Shaw, as we know, is a civil servant, and I think it becomes, from these dates, it becomes very clear what's going on. William Shaw has been at the meeting the 27th, the day before, and he comes back to his office on the 28th of December, and he writes down what they all agreed to do the day before. And he does that because he knows that the next time they're all going to be back together again is the 27th of December in a year's time. So he's not going to let them forget. He's not going to let them claim that they can't remember what was said. He puts it in writing and said, he's saying basically, hey guys, this is what we agreed to do yesterday. That, of course, suggests that he was present in the lodge, or at least present at the meeting of in the Isle of St. John the Evangelist, in order to know what was going on. And I suspect we'll never prove it, of course, because the written records for the 27th of December didn't exist until after William Shaw on the 28th of December says, you'll now keep written records. So there is no written record of him being initiated in the lodge because his instruction to record initiations didn't exist. So that's why I think William Shaw knew exactly what to put in his statutes for the governance and the regulation of these stonemasons lodges in Scotland. He knew them intimately. And when you look at the document, it's fairly lengthy. I mean, this meeting, it wouldn't be over in 30 minutes. It would have gone on for some considerable time, especially if they're all talking, and the conclusions they come to is the result of what results in the Shaw statutes. So, and therefore that's why these documents, in my opinion, are incredibly important, because they tie up what happened before William Shaw's time and what happened after his time. And he, I suppose, as I said, I think on Wednesday, what he's doing is he's formalizing an existing structure. He comes along, he sees what's going on, he joins in the meetings, and he realizes there's no record, there is no means of preserving the secrets or the ancient lore or the way of doing things. And so that's why he decides the statutes are very important. So we get to the situation where the statutes are written. Unfortunately, William Shaw dies in 1602, and so we never know what, if any, other plans he has. But all the lodges in Scotland have a copy of the statutes. So even although he's passed away, they can at least look at his instructions, and with those instructions, they can govern themselves. And this is why Scottish lodges have this very independent attitude to being governed by a Grand Lodge, because they had and now we don't know just exactly how long they had this independence. We've got no way of knowing how long they were conducting their affairs independently before Shaw came along, but we now know that when Shaw died, they had to become independent. They had to stand on their own 2 feet, and they used the statutes as a guide to the way they should behave. And I rereading this, I mean, it does tell me so much that I've forgotten, and so my apologies for some of the holes in the previous delivery. But Shaw, and this again, it's amazing how you forget things, but before Shaw died, and this is something that again, people who are not historians, they hear about these musty, dusty old documents, and how can they be important? Well, they can be important because they give us a window onto what was happening at the time. They give us a chance to look into the minds of the people who wrote these documents. And we also get some kind of idea about the people who were receiving the documents and reading them, and what they understood them to be, and how important or not they had to be. Now, William Shaw, as I say, he died in April 1602. And I strongly suspect he knew he was dying, because in 1601, he made a very unusual, he took a very unusual step. He approached William St. Clair of Roslin to become patron and protector of the craft of stonemasons in Scotland. Okay, now that document still exists. It's called the St. Clair Charter. Wrongly, it's not a charter at all, it's a letter. It's a letter signed by William St. Clair and all the lodges in Scotland. The master and wardens of every lodge in Scotland signed this letter addressed to William St. Clair, asking him to be their patron and protector. And this is where the spurious idea that William St. Clair was a Grand Master of the Masons of Scotland comes from. But there is no such thing as a Grand Master. The Grand Master doesn't exist until 1717, or probably a bit later. But so William Shaw, I think, knows that he's dying. He knows that that when he's gone, the stonemasons will have nobody to go to for advice, nobody to consult, and so he gets together with the stonemasons and says, with the lodges, stonemasons. It's important, not the guild. He gets the lodges together, and he writes this letter, and these masons sign it when they could, and I'll read a little bit here because it's quite interesting. And they sign it and they send it to William St. Clair. And when I say it's a letter, it's a bit of a begging letter. It's sort of saying, please, will you be someone who looks after us? And what they're actually asking, and this is explicit in this letter, is that the lodges and Shaw are asking William St. Clair to become an arbitrator. So, in other words, the Masons have arguments about building work or apprentices or whatever. But of course, in those days, you couldn't just go to court to resolve your disputes. It was very expensive, very slow. So that was the primary function that William St. Clair was being asked to fulfill. He was being asked to judge the disputes, the internal disputes of the stonemasons. And of course, the reason why it's a begging letter is that they say in the letter, by the way, you're not going to get paid for doing this job. So that's why it's full of grandiose words and trying to flatter this man to come and do this job for nothing. Unfortunately for us, or more unfortunately for the stonemasons, William St. Clair was a very poor choice. He was a Roman Catholic, and he made no secret of the fact that he was a Roman Catholic. Rosslyn Chapel was his property, his private property, so he could practice his Roman Catholic faith, and the church, the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, could do nothing about it because it was private property. So he had his own priest, and they were doing the usual rites of the Roman Catholic Church. And unfortunately, William St. Clair must have been a bit of a naughty boy, because he had a fling with a mill girl and got her pregnant. And of course, the church thought, the Scottish church thought, now we've got him, he's committed a carnal sin, an affront to God. And of course, they went after him, and he ran away to Ireland to avoid being condemned by the church. So anyway, to cut a long story short, he was not a very good choice. He never, ever performed any of the duties that the lodges were hoping that he would perform. And of course, then William St. Clair died just months later. And so that's why there was no authority figure for these lodges. And as I say, they were now totally reliant on the written statutes for help. Now, what is interesting, and I'd forgotten about this, but the St. Clair Charter 1601 has got a very interesting, it's the first known list of lodges. That's what I'm getting at. And the people who signed it, for example, you've got for the Lodge of Edinburgh, Andrew Simonson and John Robeson sign on behalf of the Lodge of Edinburgh. Peter Campbell and J. Valence sign for the Lodge in Haddington. George Ayton and John Wester and Thomas Pittencrieff signed for Aitchison's Haven. But there's more than just these very old lodges. what they do at the end, for those who, and this is just to substantiate the fact that these were illiterate, and I'll just give you one example. It says, Robert Caldwell in Glasgow, with my hand at the pen, led by the notary, the lawyer, led by the notary, undersubscribed for me because I cannot write myself. And this was very typical of people who couldn't write their own name. They would get a lawyer, or a writer as they're called in Scotland. The writer would hold the pen, and the illiterate person would put their hand on top of the hand of the lawyer or writer, and the lawyer would write his name. So he was signing his name, but only by placing his hand literally on top of the lawyer's hand. So that's why we know that the majority of these people were illiterate. So that brings us back to this question of, why was William Shaw so interested in these stonemasons' lodges? They certainly had no interest, no common interest in terms of their position within society. William Shaw was probably a well-paid individual. He wouldn't mix with people who were stonemasons. He would have royal connections. Stonemasons didn't. But he clearly thought enough of the stonemasons and what they were doing to think that they were important, not in terms of their position in society, not in terms of wealth, but in terms of their knowledge and what it was that he wanted them to preserve. So we have to think that, and that in itself reinforces the fact that he must have been in the lodge in order to understand all this stuff. So he finds something very special in these stonemasons' lodges. And when he realizes that he's dying, he tries to find someone who's going to step in and do what he's been doing. As I say, unfortunately, it was a bad choice. So I mean, coming back, and this is where I now get into this kind of the esoteric side of things. And if you find this boring, my apologies. I think it's very important because it gives us some kind of way of understanding what was attracting people who were not stonemasons into the lodges, so much so that by the time we get to the end of the century, there are some lodges that have got no connection to stonemasons whatsoever. They are essentially speculative lodges. So what is it that's the attraction, and what is it that William Shaw thinks it's worth preserving and instructing the lodges to preserve it? Well, for me, and again, we're now on at the point where we're moving into opinion rather than fact, but it's my opinion that William Shaw, because we know he was a master of this, the art of memory, he was a master of that, but as well as that, that means he also was aware of the system of hermeticism of which the art of memory was part. So this is, as I say, and this is something that's happening in aristocratic circles in Scotland, and Shaw was part of that circle. So he's trying to get the lodges to adopt this system of memorization. Now, we have in Scotland a curious situation where there are orders which are not Masonic, but are similar. As long ago as this, the oldest one you may have heard of is the Order of Free Gardeners. And they too began as ordinary lodges of working gardeners, operative gardeners, if you like, and they developed their own system of 3 degrees, apprentice gardener, journeyman gardener, and master gardener. Their minute books still exist from 1640, and they were fairly widespread across the country. And interestingly enough, in their first minute book, they talk about dealing with gardeners in Germany, specifically in Germany, and they're trying to import seeds and plants from Germany in exchange from seeds and plants from Scotland. And I suspect Germany were getting the better deal, because anything that grows in Scotland is going to last quite well in a warmer climate. So anyway, what I'm getting at is there's a parallel here with a very similar organization running in tandem with the Freemasons or the stonemasons. So you've got the gardeners and the masons, and they are both following a very similar path with esoteric content. Now, and I haven't, we are now talking about a hypothesis. In the 16th, and certainly for the majority of the 17th century, illiterate people only had access to one book. They couldn't read it, they had to listen to it, or they had someone who could read it to them. So let me put it this way. What is the first garden in the Bible? It's the Garden of Eden. And when you read the Free Gardener's Ritual, it's all based on the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve and the expulsion from the garden and the committing of the original sin. At the same time, the people who are reading this book, what's the first stone building in the Bible? King Solomon's Temple. Not the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel is built from brick, and no stonemason would have anything to do with working in brick. So here you have two organizations at a very similar point in time in the small country on the northwestern edge of Europe, and they are inventing things to try and rationalize the world around them. And of course, they not only use their working experience during the day, they're looking at scripture for inspiration. And so the gardeners use the Garden of Eden as the basis of their ritual, and the masons, the stonemasons, use King Solomon's Temple for their ritual. Now, we have other examples which kind of supports that hypothesis. The free shipwrights. That's the carpenters that made wooden boats. What is the first wooden boat in the Bible? Well, of course, it's Noah's Ark. So what is their ritual based on? Noah building his ark and getting in the animals 2 by 2. There's also the vintners, the free vintners, the wine merchants. What's the first explanation of wine in the Bible? Admittedly in the New Testament. And of course, this is Jesus Christ turning water into wine. What's their ritual based on? Guess. So you can see, I think, that there is a potential for, and this, as far as I can see, this only takes place in Scotland, where working men take their daily working lives and their experience in their daily working lives and marry that together with things that are in Scripture. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that there was a large element of pride involved in this. If you're a stonemason and you're listening to what is being stated in Kings and Chronicles, I bet you they sat up and said, wait a minute, people like me built King Solomon's Temple. It was my trade, my craft that built King Solomon's Temple. And once they realized that, it would be almost inconceivable for them to use any other structure on which to base the ritual. And I think because of the gardeners and the rites, that is supported by other examples in Scotland at the same time. So this is where the esoteric element comes in. And I'm not going to go into the other orders because I think it's important that we focus on the Masons. The art of memory, and I'm going to explain this in a bit of detail. And again, I hope I don't bore you with this, but I think it's important. We know that the Masons concentrate, focus on King Solomon's Temple. That's the core of their ritual, okay? And I'll come to the actual ritual that they used in a minute. But what I'm looking at here now is they have looked, and it would be unavoidable. They could not have missed it. They go to church several times on a Sunday, several times during the week, and they are listening to the building of King Solomon's Temple. So they adopt that as the central element of their ritual. Now, the art of memory, the Greek version, requires the expert, the memory man, the man who's going to recite the book to you. It requires the individual, and this is down to his personal choice. He has to choose a building with which he is familiar, and that building represents a book. So the Iliad, maybe he would choose the Parthenon for that. The Odyssey, and perhaps he would choose the Temple of Athene for that. And that book, represented by that building, would allow him, and he would mentally walk into this building. And depending on how he decided to walk around that building, that would give him information about the book that he was reciting to his client. So if he turned right, it was one book. If he turned left, it was another book. He would turn right and he would enter a room. That room was the chapter of that book. He would go into that room and he would look at specific objects in that room. And that object, the specific object, would remind him of the theme of the chapter. It would jog his memory as to what the narrative was for that chapter, or even perhaps paragraph or page of that book. And he would go from object to object in the room until he got to the exit of that room, and that was the chapter finished. He would then enter another room and the process would start again. And then when he exited the building, eventually that was the end of the book. Now that's how the Greeks of the classic era learned about their mythology and their religion. They had experts who would use this technique to walk around. Now, knowing that the stonemasons of Scotland were aware of King Solomon's Temple, and that comes obvious later, as I'll explain. They're very well aware, as the Free Gardeners were, of the Garden of Eden. The Masons are well aware of King Solomon's Temple. And William Shaw is telling them to use the art of memory to memorize what? Well, Shaw doesn't say, and neither do the Masons say. And you've got to remember, of course, this is all memory. It's all oral. It's not to be written down. It's to be memorized. Now, to my mind, and again, it's still a hypothesis, to my mind, what it is that these stonemasons, they can't resist using King Solomon's Temple as their building for the art of memory to memorize whatever it was that William Shaw's telling them to memorize. And I think it's obviously got to be the ritual, because as I said before, if it was a word or a handshake or whatever, you wouldn't need the art of memory for that. You would just, well, that's the word, that's the word for an entered apprentice, that's the word for a fellow of craft. He's asking them to memorize something far greater than that. And I think it's the ritual, and I think we can prove it. Now, what happens after William Shaw dies, unfortunately for us in Scotland, was that, or perhaps fortunately, we'll never know for sure, but William Shaw dies. There is no central figure of authority. The lodges use the Shaw statutes for most of that century. In fact, they use it and they refer to it. It's the thing. It's the thing that they use to determine disputes. anything that goes wrong, first thing they do is look at this. And they get to the point where they start to build up lodge rules. Each lodge ends up with different rules because of their experience of using the Shaw statutes to resolve a problem. So we have one more important document, and I know I mean, I love my documents, as you can tell. The next document is very important in our history of pre-1770 Freemasonry is another document called the Second St. Clair Charter. And this is addressed to the son of the first St. Clair, the one that ran away to Ireland because he got into trouble with the church. This is the son, his son. And this is another begging letter being sent to William St. Clair. So this shows a continuity of knowledge. Shaw's dead, but the lodges are aware that William St. Clair of Roslin had been approached 27 years before, because this document is dated 1628. And it is, again, it's appealing to the William St. Clair of Roslin, the son, asking him to become patron and protector. And this guy actually thinks that this is something that he should do, and he does make a serious attempt at being the guy who looks after the stonemasons of Scotland. Now, for a whole variety of reasons, the plan doesn't work, mainly because of interference at government level in London, but we can leave that for another time. The point I'm getting at is that it's clear that there is a memory embodied or embedded in these stonemasons' lodges from at least the time of Shaw, and of course Shaw says they existed before. So William Shaw has gone. The St. Clairs of Roslin turn out to be of no actual use, despite what some of our pop historians might say. The St. Clairs are there, but they're not of any actual practical use to the stonemasons of Scotland. They instead have to rely on their own devices and the statues. But then something else very interesting happens, because in 1641, this is a time of war. It's called the Bishops' War, religious wars essentially, where the son of James VI is trying to impose a church rule using bishops, which of course smacks of the Roman Catholic Church that almost a century before had been wiped away. And so the Scots weren't very happy about that. The Presbyterians weren't happy about being dictated to by the king through bishops. So they ended up in a war. I mean, you probably all heard about the Scots and kind of things they get up to. But anyway, they besiege Newcastle on Tyne, where the royal forces are a garrison. And during that time, a very important individual is initiated into the Lodge of Edinburgh, Mary's Chapel, number one, and this is Sir Robert Moray. Now, Sir Robert Moray was a Hermeticist. We know this from his own writings. He was very interested in alchemy. He conducted experiments into turning lead into gold. And he was a member of the Royal Society. He knew Elias Ashmole. And he was, in fact, the first president, I think, of the Royal Society. He is the first person on record anywhere to describe what Freemasonry meant to him. And he goes into fairly great detail about the symbolism, what the symbolism of the craft meant to him personally, what he got out of being a member of this Edinburgh Lodge. And I suppose we should explain very quickly the reason why he joined this lodge in Newcastle. What it was is that members of the lodge in Edinburgh had been conscripted into the Scottish Army, in order to provide bridges. Yeah, they were a pioneer corps, engineers, and they did what was necessary to keep the army moving. And when they were besieging Newcastle on Tyne, they held a lodge meeting. They initiated Sir Robert Moray, who was the quartermaster general, very important senior guy. He was the quartermaster general of the Scottish Army, and they also initiated Alexander. The name's just slipped off the tip of my tongue. Armstrong, and Alexander. He was the general of artillery. He was in charge of the cannon that was being used to attack Newcastle on Tyne. So two extremely important individuals become members of this lodge at the same time. When the war is over and the Scots Army is dispersed, the members of the Lodge of Edinburgh from Newcastle go back to Edinburgh, and they report to the lodge that they have initiated Sir Robert Moray and Anthony Alexander, I think it was now, not Armstrong, Anthony Alexander. They've initiated these two characters into the lodge, and these are called, in those days, out entries. So although he wasn't in Scotland, he was initiated into a Scottish lodge in England. So this is the first initiation of a speculative Freemason on English soil. And the career of Sir Robert Moray gives us a clue as to the esoteric side of the craft at this very, very early stage. And the reason we know this is that because Robert Moray he was one of these guys who was into everything, and he became a spy and ended up in Maastricht in Holland, in the south of Holland, where he describes himself as being nailed. He can't leave, and he is spying on he's spying on everybody because he's being paid by the English and the Dutch and the French, I think. In fact, the French thought he was a really, really important person, but he was playing all sides. Anyway, when he was in Maastricht, he's initiated into the Lodge of he's initiated into the Guild of Stonemasons, who consult him on how to build the town hall of Maastricht, which is actually still standing. So the town hall that he designed is the town hall of the city of Maastricht. Anyway, you can tell I'm beginning to ramble a little bit because I find this so interesting. Anyway, so Robert Moray, the Hermeticist, the alchemist, is known to people like Robert Flood. Is it Robert Flood? Other alchemists and Hermeticists of his time. And this is a period where everything's up for grabs. Everybody's investigating everything. And there is no such thing as a pure science at this time. So anything is interesting. The tides, how fish breathe underwater. This is all things that Moray was investigating, as well as trying to turn lead into gold. Now, what happened was that while he's in Maastricht and he can't leave for whatever reason, I think he's under suspicion, his friend, the Earl of Kincardine, who's traveling in Europe, ends up being stuck in an inn in Hamburg. And in Hamburg, he falls ill, and he gets some kind of recurring fever. We're not sure what it was, but it seems like it's something that the fever comes to a head every third day. So the first day he's becoming sickly. The second day he's struck with fever. The third day he's recovering, and then the whole process begins again. Now, what Sir Robert Moray does is he uses his skills to write to the Earl of Kincardine in this inn in Hamburg, and he's treating him. He's trying to treat him medically, morally, and masonically. And these letters is where we find all the information about the esoteric elements of early Masonry from his letters, because he explains explains to his friend, the Earl of Kincardine, what it means to be a Mason. It's nothing to do with the art of stone masonry. It is the symbolism of it, the morality of it, the philosophy of it, and how this can make the world a better place. So he goes into this in great detail. Unfortunately, Sir Robert Murray is considered to be a fairly minor figure in the history of Scotland, even although he's the first president of the Royal Society, the first investigative science body in the world, the Royal Society. He's the first president. He's the man who lobbies the king to grant that society a charter, a royal charter, which makes it beyond legitimate. It makes it the favourite organisation of the king. So it's incredibly important for the beginning of science and the advancement of science. But Robert Murray, in the main, has been forgotten, except, oddly enough, in the Scottish craft. And of course, as David mentioned when he was reading the introduction to me, my introduction, he mentioned that I was a past master of Lodge Sir Robert Murray, 1641. And of course, Sir Robert Murray was initiated in the lodge in Edinburgh in the year 1641. So us Scots love our synchronicity of things. So Sir Robert Murray is a research lodge in his memory. So how do we know just what it was? Well, I'm going to say just what it was. How do we know anything about what these stonemasons were thinking, what they saw as important, why they joined the lodge and kept coming back? I mean, once you joined, you didn't have to attend every single meeting. You could join, get your password, and go on your merry way. But these people, just like we do today, they join a lodge and we go back again and again and again. So something was attracting them, something interesting enough to get them coming back, meeting after meeting. And we can see that from these minutes. So this is where we get to the more than a hypothesis. We now get back to these dusty old documents, the oldest lodge rituals in the world. Now, again, I'm quite sure most of you know about them, but for those who perhaps don't, the oldest one is known as the Register, the Edinburgh Register House manuscript. That's named after where it is in the National Archive. That document is dated 1696. The next one is the early manuscript, which was only discovered a few years ago. The early manuscript, and I'll mention that one again in a minute. The early manuscript, which is dated 1705. The next one's the Chetwood Crawley manuscript of circa 1710. And perhaps almost more fascinating than these is what they call the Hotfoot fragment, which is dated 1702. And these rituals are all very similar. There's different spellings, different punctuation, different layouts, but they are all pretty similar. And a lot of people probably think, and I tend to believe this too, that because these are pretty consistent in content, it looks to me like there was one ritual that was common to all the lodges in Scotland at the time. And that's supported by the very fact that regardless of where these rituals were found, in Dundee to the north of Edinburgh, the Chetwood Crawley was found in Dublin, Ireland, but it isn't Irish, it's Scottish. We know that from the language. And of course, the Hotfoot fragment, and then there's others like the Kievan and all the rest of it. All these things appear to be some kind of a copy of one original that is now, unfortunately, lost. And why we think it's a common document to the whole of Scotland is there is a question in the, unfortunately, we can't go into great detail, but there is a presentation I do about, let's go through it line by line, what it means, bringing out the esoteric. And there is very deep esoteric meanings in the ritual. But there is one question where someone is asked, what is the name of your lodge? And every single one of these rituals asks that question, and every single one has the same answer: Kilwinning. So everybody in Scotland, every lodge in Scotland is aware of the lodge of Kilwinning. Now, that's even true of lodges in Edinburgh and Dundee. There's David waving. So we can see, have
No,
I talked all that
just
long already?
just a reminder that it is so interesting. We just had 1 hour. Just a reminder, you can keep talking, and I think it's
Okay. Well,
interesting.
perhaps
Or you
perhaps
can wrap up for so we can have time for Q&A. Whichever way we take, it's
okay.
up to you.
Right. Okay. Well,
Just a
yeah.
reminder. That's it.
Yeah. I think okay. It's kind of a neat point to finish actually, because these rituals, and you'll notice these rituals are all before 1717. They come from different parts of Scotland and indeed Ireland. They all mention one of the most important lodges in the history of Freemasonry, Kilwinning. So it seems to me that I think from what I've said today and on Wednesday, that we have a kind of a chronology that is fairly consistent for certainly for well over 100 years and probably much earlier, as I believe. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. I probably need another sip of water, and it's not gin or vodka, by the way, it is water. I'd say thank you very much for listening, and I'll try and answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much. I think yes, Tim. I've been and everyone else was. I'll unmute you. Don't worry. Okay, something is wrong with your mic, I guess. I cannot unmute. Okay, now you are on. So, floor is for Tim. He has very interesting questions already shared with us.
Hi, Brother Bob. It's very nice to see you.
Hello.
For all you who don't know, Bob probably is concerned that I'm stalking him. I have questions for him every chance I get. But he is the expert on William Shaw, and it's kind of part of my research into my family heritage. So I bugged him a lot. Are you going to stop short of saying then that the unwritten evidence, the unwritten logic indicates that William Shaw was a speculative Freemason prior to 1598?
I think he certainly was. And there's no doubt in my mind, but that's a personal view. The historian would say, prove it. And we can't prove it except by circumstantial evidence. And my circumstantial evidence, I think, is pretty damn strong because, as I say, he couldn't have written the statutes without the knowledge of what the lodge was doing. So he must have been present at the lodge. He couldn't have. And just to confuse it, of course, we know that his clerk, his scribe, Alexander Bothwell, must have been present at the meeting as well, because of the fact that he wrote out these statutes multiple times, sending one copy to every known lodge in Scotland. So there was probably...
That's what David had said on the comments, yes.
Right. Fascinating stuff.
So the question is, you say that there's no proof, but it's logical proof, the way we prove a theorem, that to talk about the secrets, he must have known the secrets openly amongst the other lodges. So to refer to the secrets, logically, he knew the secrets and was a Freemason.
Yeah. I mean, there's also strong evidence from the documents themselves, because he's writing this on the 28th of December, and Aitchison's at their very next meeting on the 9th of January, start to keep written records, just as he told them to.
Right.
So again, so it's all down to William Shaw, and he can't be giving orders and instructions to everybody in Scotland without knowing what he's talking about.
Does his name appear on the minutes for meetings prior to, or or after that period of time in any lodge in Scotland?
No, because that's down to the lodge to keep those records, not to him. But he does sign, obviously, he does sign the Shaw Statutes. He signs the St. Clair Charters, the first one anyway. And his signatures, I mean, his signature is well, common, shall we say. It's one of the best known signatures from that time because he was responsible for paying wages and things. So he signed off lots of money transactions. So we know it's his signature. Yeah. All right.
Tim,
Thanks for coming along tonight.
Tim, would you ask regarding the construction of the chapel by your ancestor? I see.
Yes. So Holyrood Chapel was reconstructed in preparation for Anne coming home with James, the new bride, and she was with child, with bairn, they say. He reconstructed the Holyrood Chapel. He did the whole area, Stirling Castle, also, but he did Holyrood on the plan of King Solomon's Temple. There's been research to show that it's laid out on the model of King Solomon's Temple, and this would have been in the 1580s. So does that mean James was a practitioner, was a Mason as well? King James?
I would need to look at that again. I mean, I think that the Chapel Royal in Stirling Castle probably reflects the layout of King Solomon's Temple. Simply 2 chambers. My understanding is the chapel at Rosslyn Chapel at Holyrood Palace is a bit more complex than that. But then he would be working probably with what he had inherited, whereas the chapel in Stirling was built from scratch. So that's why he could impose his design on that. And as far as we know, that's the only complete building that was built under his instruction. So that's why I actually think that's more important than any other building. So we don't know. We don't know for sure, but I think Stirling proves your point without needing Holyrood Palace.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, for interesting insights and questions. And nice meeting you here.
You too.
So now the floor goes to Levan G. Levan?
Thank you, David. Thank you, Bob, again for the fascinating lecture. I think I'll try to rephrase my question from the previous lecture and still try to understand how the stonemasons possessed that knowledge. And I would ask you in the sense of how can it be linked to the fact that there's a theory that after the tragic events in France, then sometime afterwards, Templars or let's say the Templars arrived to Scotland, and then there was the building in the middle of 15th century of the Rosslyn Chapel, and there's also the theory that William St. Clair back then in the middle of 15th century was also a speculative Freemason.
Their team shows a book, I guess.
And maybe that is how those rituals actually got into the hands of the stonemasons, and then maybe rediscovered.
Yeah,
Thank you, Levan.
We have a problem as Freemasons as much as a problem as a historian. What happens in the academic world is you must be able to substantiate the claim without in terms of evidence. You can't just sort of say it's my opinion. So I have no problem with people saying I believe that the Knight Templars escaped from La Rochelle, sailed up to the west coast of Scotland, and all that. I have no problem with people saying I believe that. And as a Freemason, it's a wonderful romantic story. But as a historian, I say, well, where's the evidence? Where's the evidence for that? And there is no evidence. And it's a wonderful story, and it's been stitched together by non-Masons who are really in the business of selling books. And that's part of the problem. To make it even worse, these people were not Masons and they're not Scottish. So it's a bit like me saying, well, there's a big chunk of history of the United States missing. I'm just going to lift 100 years of Canadian history and stick it in there so that I can go back further with the United States history and just expect nobody to notice. It's actually Canada that we're using as that piece of history. And that's the kind of thing that happens where people will take a piece of Masonic history, and the Regius manuscript that was mentioned on Wednesday is a classic example of that, where it's used as the start point for English Freemasonry, but then there's a gap of 600 years or 500 years where there's nothing at all. So, but they use things like, well, they will talk about the Masons doing this and the Masons doing that. And ultimately it's a problem, because for me, I have a bit of a problem because I'm a Freemason and a historian. So do I really want to destroy the beliefs of my fellow Masons? You see what I mean? You see the situation I'm in, because I can deconstruct all these arguments piece by piece. But do I, or should I, do that to my fellow Freemasons? If they genuinely believe that, then is it right for me to prove that they are wrong? It's a difficult one, and that's why sometimes your questions put me on the spot a little bit. That's why you write a book, so I don't have to argue with you. I just say read the book, and then I'll probably never hear from you again as a friend.
Thank you very much.
So don't read the book.
Thank you very much, Bob.
That's exactly right. Don't read the book.
If I may, that leads to a second question, a little bit of more of a different kind, with regards to should we or should we not talk about the facts and hence destroy somebody's faith or how to say rebuke, or I don't know how to say the word, somebody's faith. Like, if is there a kind of a moral dilemma? So if we know something, even though maybe it's a secret or not a secret, doesn't matter, but if we know something and can objectively and with arguments and enough arguments prove somebody wrong, in this sense, when there's a question asked, like, I'm not saying going into somebody's private space and then talk, what is there a moral dilemma of not doing it?
Yeah, I would never presume to challenge somebody's belief or faith. That's a very personal thing for them. And this is where we get to, and this is kind of like the philosophy of history, if you like, where if somebody says, I believe the Knight Templars went to Scotland, and I say, that's fine, you know. Whereas when somebody says to me, the Knight Templars went to Scotland and I can prove it, that's when the historian takes over and says, okay, up till this point, it was a belief, and I'm happy for you to have that belief. Now you're telling me that you can prove it. And I say, right now, as a historian, I can look at your proof, and I will come to a conclusion as to whether your proof is good enough for a historian to accept without getting involved into the belief. And this is where the problem arises. And I can understand what your question is, but I think you've got to remember that at the time these stonemasons were developing their beliefs, developing their ritual, there was only one faith available. one faith and one faith only, and that was Christianity. And so there was not a big debate about what people should believe. It was more about how you interpreted that and how you used it to benefit and improve yourself. That's why the Masons saw absolutely no problem whatsoever in using King Solomon's temple for the ritual, because it was in scripture. And so they saw themselves as supporting the Christian faith, because they were using the teaching of the church, who said that the Old Testament was very, very important, although it tended to be that it was supposedly a precursor to the New Testament. But the fact remains that they were using scripture not for religious purposes, and this is where our detractors forget. The Masons are using scripture not for religious purposes. They are using it because it's such a wonderful story and it's related to their trade. It's as simple as that. There is no religious connotation. So they thought it was great. They were doing nothing wrong.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, a long answer for a short question.
No, it's just,
Sorry.
I actually wanted a more long and detailed answer. Thank you very much for that, Bob.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Levan. The floor is for Clovis Gregorio, please.
Yeah, Clovis.
Clovis.
Hi, bro, Cooper. Hi,
Hello
Al.
there. Hi. How are you?
Sorry for my bad English, but about the manuscript and the book register house, the 1696, the three distinct knocks ritual in the confidence of the Grand Lodge of Ancients, but I know that this ritual is the origin in Irish practices. Do you believe this somehow descends from the Scottish practice, or are they relatives or similar?
So you think you're asking, did the Edinburgh Register House manuscript come from the religion, the Scottish?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. The manuscript in the book register houses somehow descends from the three distinct notes. Somehow descends from the Scottish priests.
Yeah, the Presbyterian faith. Yeah, I think when you read the ritual, it's pretty clear that they. I mean, can't really say too much, but when they take the oath, they are specifically citing Christianity for taking the oath, and that would be in Scotland at that time. It was. You've got to be careful here. It was certainly Protestant. Whether it was Presbyterian or not, it's another matter, because it came and went. You know, there was all sorts of factions and things, but it was certainly the Protestant faith, and they very specifically cite parts of the Christian faith at that time. So yes, but that's all they knew. They didn't know anything else. You know, they had no contact with Muslims or Buddhists or anything like that. They only had their own Protestant belief to use. So your English is much better than my Portuguese, by the way.
Thank you, bro, Bob.
Okay.
Thank you, Gregorio. I guess Brother John Smith had a question. Raise the hand. Have you?
Thank you, David, and
Yep.
thank you,
Welcome.
Bob, again. For
Floor is yours.
can you hear me?
Before you ask, sorry for interrupting you, brothers. If anyone wants to ask question or drop a line in the chat, or there is this tool saying raise the hand, and I will see in the list who wants to ask a question.
Yes,
So I don't miss anybody. Thank you. Sorry, John. Floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Brother Bob, two questions, one in the beginning and perhaps one at the end. Perhaps I can ask the end one first because I might forget it. Why kill winning?
Well, I think it's one of those situations where they were well known. They were simply well known the length and breadth of Scotland, and this is almost certainly from before Shaw's time. We know that the second Shaw statutes were written by Shaw as a direct reaction to Kilwinning complaining that they had basically been ignored by Shaw. So everybody knew Kilwinning in the Scottish lodges. Unfortunately, William Shaw didn't know about Kilwinning, and he had a problem for that reason. So it's as simple as that. It was the lodge that was known throughout Scotland.
Okay, thank you. And then coming back to William Shaw, in your previous lecture, you said that he was, and I can't remember exactly what his title was, but he was in charge of the king's palaces and summer houses, etc., etc. And the impression I got was that he would go around prior to the king's visit and he would make sure that they're in order. Have you discovered anything why he opted for the stonemasons rather than the gardeners? Because surely the gardens also had to be trimmed and in order.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it's as simple as this, because as Scotland began to get richer, although that everything's relative, the aristocracy, and this is typical across Europe. Once the aristocracy got enough money, they got away from the slum conditions of the towns and cities, and they moved out into the countryside where they would build a beautiful house where it was clean, was fresh water, and it wasn't contaminated with all these dirty citizens and everything. Now the building had to be built by stonemasons first, and I'm pretty sure, and we can see this from the minutes, the gardeners came along later to lay out the gardens around these stone buildings. So they saw what the stonemasons were doing, they saw how they were organized, and that's why the first Free Gardeners Lodge exists in Haddington, where all these big country houses were being built. And I think that's exactly, they didn't need to reinvent the wheel, they just copied what the stonemasons were already doing. The big difference was that they too looked at the Old Testament, found the Garden of Eden, and that's why their rituals based on that. But in terms of organization, they simply copied what the stonemasons were already doing.
I see.
Shaw would, yeah, and of course Shaw, remember, was in charge of the buildings. He was not in charge of gardens or we called them parks.
Sure.
But anyway, sorry, I digress.
Bob, can I just ask one last question? William Sinclair, was that mere coincidence that he was approached, or was?
Well, I think there would be contact. I mean, there would be. We know that William Sinclair, when he was building the chapel way back in 1446, in order to entice the stonemasons, probably from Edinburgh, to go out to Rosslyn. Remember, this was something like 8 miles from the city, so that was fairly scary journey for people who sort of lived in the city to go out to the countryside and build somebody a church. What he did in order to entice them out of the city to build his chapel is he actually gave them land and allowed them to build their own stone buildings on that land. So this kind of memory, and I think we see this going all the way through all this memory of the Sinclair family's involvement a way back 200 years earlier, or 250 years earlier, was still in the memory of the stonemasons. And that's why they approached William Sinclair, because there was a tradition, and it's nice to have a continuity and all that kind of stuff. But
okay.
Okay, my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brother John. Brother Aldris has a question. Aldris, floor is yours.
you. First of all, Brother Bob, my very warmest appreciation for such a beautiful lectures. And I very honestly say that I never had such a clear, consistent explanation with a wonderful flow of mind. I'm really very much impressed. Thank you so much for being with us. My question would be regarding the esoterics, depending what we mean by esoterics. Maybe from the point of understanding more conceptual meaning of the ritual itself. First of all, do you know, or is there some evidence, or simply you can say that the ritual remains the same as it was in these centuries we are talking about? And if it differs somehow, what is the concept from the esoteric point of view, not only proving the facts like that, but what is the context of the ritual?
Well,
what about it was?
Okay.
If it differs a bit. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think there was much in the way of difference from lodge to lodge. The ritual was pretty consistent across the whole of Scotland. And that was essential because as Masons went from lodge to lodge, they had to have a fairly standard understanding of what was going on in every lodge. So if I was a visitor to another lodge and they were using a ritual that I had never heard of or couldn't understand, then I would be lost. I wouldn't be able to prove that I was a Mason from another lodge. So a fairly common ritual was necessary for the whole country. Now, I don't know whether, I suspect William Shaw's requirement that everybody memorize this. There was no point, I mean, remember this instruction goes to every lodge. It would be impossible for every lodge to memorize something different from every other lodge. So his instruction is that all the lodges memorize something, and it had to be the same something. So I think that's why the ritual begins to be fairly consistent across the country. And that seems to be pretty much the same when we actually get the written ones, which show that they are pretty much the same. There are some differences, but pretty much the same. The esoteric content, of course, would be essentially the same as well, because there would be no way of having different esoteric content from one ritual to another. So, and this is why ritual in some ways is very important. You get a non-Mason reading the ritual, that doesn't worry me, because the ritual is simply words on a page. It's the meaning that's important. So, for example, everybody knows about the Good Samaritan. We live in a day and age where everybody's more interested in who was the Good Samaritan, where did he come from, where did he live, what kind of status in society. That's irrelevant. It's not what the Good Samaritan was or who he was or whether he was alive or what. What is important is what he did. And that's the importance of the ritual. It's what the ritual conveys. Now, for it to convey something, it has to be the same for every lodge. Otherwise, nobody could understand what's going on. So the moral teachings, the philosophy, the esoteric knowledge has to be the same across the whole country. Otherwise, there was no point in people going from one lodge to another. And we do know that that did happen. One of the lodges, I think it's the Lodge of Edinburgh, in 1650 records that a brother from the lodge in Linlithgow came along and proved that he was fit to be admitted to that lodge. So he must have had the same ritual as the lodge he was visiting. But as I say, the ritual is just the superficial. That's the words on a page. It's the meaning that's important. And he must have been able to prove that he had the same esoteric knowledge in his lodge as the one that he visited. Otherwise, they wouldn't have allowed him to visit. Is that, I hope.
Just to bit specify, the ritual is more or less the same as it was before. Not more or less the same, but exactly, probably it came from those ages. And
Yeah.
which, as far as I know, there are several rituals we are aware about, somehow related, or semi-Scottish or Scottish rituals. Which one of these was the most significant and used for this time?
Well, I can tell you, for me, the most significant one is the early manuscript, which is the most recently discovered one. And the reason why that's significant is simply we know who owned it. And this was the early family, and it was the Early's the family name. I'm trying to remember the aristocratic name. It will come to me. Anyway, it was found in his library just outside Dundee. And it was discovered, his library was transferred to the National Archive, and this document is in there. But he was master of the lodge in Dundee. We know that from the Dundee records. And this is why it's wonderful to have all these records, because you find a document inside an aristocrat's house. On its own, it doesn't mean much, but when you tie up to the minutes of the lodge, then you can see this man had kept a copy of the ritual from the lodge. Now that came from Dundee. The other rituals came from, were found in Ireland. One was in Edinburgh, one was in the Scottish borders, and they're all pretty much the same. So I think the esoteric content has to be the same as well. I don't see how it couldn't be. It has to be. I mean, it wouldn't make sense to have different esoteric content with the vehicle to transmit the esoteric knowledge is the same. So the bus is the same, and so the passengers on the bus are the same. Has to be. Sorry, it's not a good analogy, I know, but.
Brother Rodriguez, anything to clarify, or you're fine? Okay, great.
Do you agree? Are you happy with that? Or?
Would you want to comment on that, Brother Rodriguez?
You see,
well,
let me put this way.
I'm still trying to focus on the explanation maybe of the esoterics.
Yeah,
from,
see, I can't,
from the ages, because as we know, there was some transformations there. There are different variety of rituals later on until nowadays, and it has been transformed.
Yes,
so
that's right.
And also the context of the rituals, they are also quite different. They progress in some understanding, and in some understanding they decline. They go away from the sometimes from the key points, or maybe we can say that they are focused on some other key points. So very essential would for
That's
me.
Right. Yeah, here we come to the this is where we come to the problem of a public forum, because I mean personally, I think I've said this before. These stonemasons were illiterate, but they weren't stupid. And what they have done is they've used the ritual to bury esoteric knowledge within the ritual. And when you start to take the ritual to pieces, line by line, and try and understand, sorry, that's my phone ringing. You take it to pieces line by line, then you can start to understand the esoteric knowledge that's embedded in the ritual. And because the ritual's the same, the esoteric knowledge has to be the same. But I'd love to be able to give you a few examples of what that is, but I can't in this situation. But we've done it before with other classes. It's fascinating in its own right, but I just can't do it here. So, sorry.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you. Brother Bob, you want to answer that? I mean, not to.
No.
You're
They'll
fine.
get fed up. Yeah, they've hung up.
Okay, so we have Brother Abraham Metz. Floor is yours, please.
Good evening, brothers from Miami, Florida. Brother Bob, it's good to see you. Brother David, always good to see
Hello.
you. So this past summer, I had the pleasure of visiting Mother Kilwinning, and also had the pleasure of attending Roslyn Chapel. Did the Masonic tour up in Roslyn. Met the Right Worshipful Past Master of Roslyn St. Class 606. And as you well know, there's some interesting history around Roslyn Chapel. There's tremendous amount of Masonic symbolism in and about the chapel. Question is, was it there from its onset, or was it placed there later on?
We come back to that problem. Do I have the right to destroy someone's treasured belief in the building? Let me, perhaps one of the best ideas would be, you see, I have a big problem with Roslyn Chapel because as a historian, I cannot see any Masonic symbolism whatsoever in the building. Not one thing is Masonic.
Really?
So if you give me one example, perhaps I could explain to you why I don't think it's a Masonic symbol.
Okay, so the acacia on the apprentice's pillar, the when you look at some of the figurines throughout the windows and the pilasters inside the chapel, you look at the position of the hands, and you know, being in the forum that we're in, I can't obviously go too much into detail, but you look at the position, the dew guards are all there, everything up to and into our Royal Arch.
Yeah, but it's not Scottish for a start. You've got to remember Scottish Freemasonry is different. The people
Right.
who make these explanations, of course, are using their Masonic knowledge from wherever they are, but it's not the way the Scots Freemasonry uses these symbols. But let me be, I mean, very specific. I mean, you mentioned acacia on our apprentice pillar. There's no such thing as acacia in the apprentice degree.
Correct. That's later on.
Yeah. So I can understand why people come, they look at it and they go, oh, sprig of acacia. But it's not, it doesn't tie up with the context in which it's shown. And I have grave concerns that I don't think it's acacia anyway. It's the same with, and here you see what you have is somebody has written a book, and I know the one where it's mentioned, and they say, I've looked at the apprentice pillar and that's acacia. But that's not proof. That's not what a historian can accept. That's somebody saying, I think that's acacia. Well, that's fine. If they say it, they think it's acacia, I don't have a problem with that. It's when they write it and says, it is acacia. So, okay, well, prove it. And they can't. I mean, it's out of context in terms of what we now know. It's out of context. Right. It couldn't have applied a way back then. So you see what I mean? So I'm terrible for this. I deconstruct every single statement and try and work out if it can be true. And I'd love it to be true. Don't get me wrong. I think it's a wonderful story. It's phenomenal, absolutely brilliant story. But the historian in me sort of says, well, okay, it's like Dan Brown's novel. I love Dan Brown's novel. It's brilliant, but it's a novel. Sure. It's fiction. So,
which also makes me question about, which came first now, because when you hear the story of the apprentice and the master, and when you see those two heads behind you when you're sitting in the chapel, and they're behind you in the corners on the left and right, and you look at the the gash in the head of the apprentice, it makes you wonder where our third degree came from. Which came first, that story or the Hiramic legend?
Well, you see, people are comparing the story of the apprentice with the story of HA. And the two stories are very different when you think about it. But I can't, on this forum, unfortunately, I can't
Right,
really
right, obviously, yeah.
But I can see what's happened. I can see the appeal. This is an apprentice pillar, first degree. I can see the logic being applied, but unfortunately, it's flawed. And I mean, anyway.
The last question I had goes back to kill winning. So, if my memory serves me correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong. So the kill winning lodge charter house, which is the old ruins, that was from about the year what, 1140?
1146, I think, to be precise. But yeah, it's a pre-monasterian order, French. But here we come back to the same old problem that, when those buildings were erected, that doesn't mean to say there was a lodge there. And when I say a lodge, I mean a lodge as we now know it. There may have been a lodge building where they stored working tools and all that kind of stuff, but whether it was a lodge that performed ritual and initiation ceremonies, we simply don't know. There's no records.
I mean, back in 1140, it would have been an actual craft lodge, and by definition, a oblong square, because that's the layout of the trotter house, was an oblong square, and the archway that's there, with the keystone, would lend rational conclusion that it was a stonemason's lodge.
But that design is common across Europe, not just to Kilwinning. You find that design everywhere. I mean, that was the easiest thing to build. It's just normal. It's the same with the layout of churches. It was a fairly standard design across Europe. And it's very difficult because you're looking at a physical object and you're trying to translate it into what we do today. And there really is no kind of common junction of the two. I mean, I would love it to be true, but without actual evidence, it's a wonderful idea, but we just don't know.
Where did how far back do the records of Kilwinning go back to, as far as when they were formed? I mean, I think they were chartered in, what about this, Kilwinning was chartered when?
Yeah, the minute books of Kilwinning begin in 1642.
1640, yeah.
Yeah, it's nothing before that. So you can see, I mean, we're talking about a gap of over 500 years. And that's as long as we have from the time of their minutes till today. So we have this huge gap where there is no information at all, and we can't fill in 500 years. We just don't know. That's the problem. That's the problem with history, and people see gaps like that and they try and fill in the gap. So I can't sort of, it's a problem. It's a real problem. But then, I mean, I know there's a lodge in Hastings, which is very near to Stonehenge. It's called Stonehenge Lodge.
Yes.
And they claim, the guys that built Stonehenge, 2,000 years before Christ must have had a lodge. You see the problem?
Yeah. Well, anyway, thank you so much for helping me fill in those gaps.
Okay.
Thank you, Brother Abraham. and for the answer. Before I pass the floor to Rafael Barajas, my question would be more procedural. Do you think it would be worth thinking or considering, Brother Bob, a possibility of checking for proper grade with whatever procedure is in place to check that the Zoom meeting cannot be tiled and it wouldn't be ritual at all, but research-wise, so we can go into more details of maybe of early ritual, just an idea for the next considerations, because I mean we are all eager to learn more, and your approach, your academic approach, kind of leaving the room for esoteric or the romantic part of it, but still it kind of gives fresh breath, new way of looking at the thing. So maybe that can be an idea for fifth, I don't know, sixth meeting, if you would be open for, because you've done this early ritual, so maybe digging into the details can be an option to the extent which we
Okay.
cannot kind of make it even with that certainty of having really bros with us.
It might be possible to take a part of the ritual
Okay.
and discuss a part of the ritual, because it's then out of context. And for anyone who's not a Mason, it would be very difficult for them to understand.
Sean,
that's possible. I need to go and look at it again, to be honest. I need to read it again, see if we can work something out.
So can we say, let's me and you talk about it, and by the end of fourth lecture, we will have an answer for interested brethren. We might have a little bit more filter who, sorry, who could participate. Okay, thank you, Brother Bob. And Brother Rafael Barajas, floor is yours, please. Rafael?
Here, okay, it's okay.
There you are.
Yeah, okay, according to the past lecture I captured with the current one, it was at the beginning of the change from the operative masonry and change to the speculative
maybe you could
one.
type.
Yeah, and one of the less evidence of this is because of the method that, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Robert?
No. No,
we hear you, but it's quite something is echoing. Maybe you don't need to be too close to the microphone. Sometimes that helps.
The microphone is down here. Okay, if you want, I can type here in the computer.
Keep going.
Okay. Oh, I gotta write it out already, so it's gonna be easy.
Oh, you're gonna share it? Okay, I'll read it for you if you have.
Okay.
If you can
I
copy
think it's because
here.
I am so far from you.
Where are you from?
From Mexico.
We have people from South Africa, so which one is further?
Yeah, it's a long way away.
Yeah, long miles from you.
And we've been waiting for New Zealandese to join us, so distance doesn't make sense for the virtual things. Okay,
that's an opinion.
Here it is, right?
Okay.
Should I read it for you? Okay.
Yeah, please.
So, Brother Bob, here is the question. According to the past lecture I captured with the current one, it was the beginning of the change from the operative masonry to the speculative one, and the evidence of this, it's because of the method that the Robert said, memory. William Shaw was the transition of this, and that's the difference that I appreciate of stonemason and Freemason, and thus why we use as much symbols.
Yeah. Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that's what the stonemasons were doing. They had all these working tools, for example, and they used them every single day. Now, they're not going to It's a bit like going to a DIY store. If you've got a garage full of working tools, you're not going to go and buy a completely new set to do something else with. You've already got them. So they're looking at the working tools saying, well, what does that mean? We know what it means at work. What does it mean away from work? Follow me? No.
I'll unmute you now. Wait.
Everything froze there for a minute, I think.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, this is more it's more than an opinion than a question. And that's why I've been following right to you and the rest of the participants of this meeting. I appreciate to be invited for you, David, and thank you, Robert, for this meeting. That's really interesting for me, and I try to share with my friends, not the meeting, not the video, but with my brothers of the Lodge. I will try to share with them this really unique experience.
Okay, well, thank you for coming along today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Rafael. Tim Shaw was asking what would be the next book. We'll have a part talking you talking about your books, but maybe you can intrigue us.
The problem is that I've got myself into a bad trap where I've got so many projects. So I do a little bit on one and then a little bit on another and a little bit on another, and none of them are going to get finished. So I need to focus on one, but probably it will be a Masonic Guide to Edinburgh. That will probably be the next one. Or the other one that I'm being pressurized into doing is the biography of William Shaw. So that's what I'm working on just now.
Thank you. Any more questions from the participants? I don't see virtually raised hands here, and I'll just check. Could you raise hand? Okay, David Duncan, floor is yours, please. Oh, Levan, I'll give you floor right after.
No, David. I was just saying that Bro David Duncan wanted to ask a question.
Okay, Brother David, the floor is yours, please. Wait, you should be unmuted yet. Wait, we don't hear you. I'm trying to unmute you. Or you do it yourself. Something with him. You're on.
Yeah.
You're on.
Okay. Firstly, I'd like to say, Robert, thank you very much for fascinating lectures. Very easy to listen to, and your style really is something very special. And David, I'd like to say thank you very much for organizing them. It really has been an absolute pleasure to be part of the first two. The question I would like is about the character of William Shaw. And you say you're going to write a biography on him. And I'm really fascinated about how this man managed to achieve what he actually did. Because if I've understood what's happened, he was essentially a civil servant. He was master of works. The guilds were essentially unions, and the lodges were craftsmen with a very fierce tradition of being independent and pretty much doing their own thing. How did he manage? And also, at the time, you had religious animosity between the Catholics and the Protestants. How did he manage to get Protestant stonemasons, craftsmen, used to working on their own, doing their own thing, to form almost a unified body under a Catholic in the terms of St. Clair? How did he manage to do that?
Yeah, that's an exceptionally good question. And this is the problem that the historians have, trying to understand the motives of people. Why would he do that? And I think it's down to his worldview. He, because he had a Catholic upbringing, but he was also very intimately involved with the Protestant church. You couldn't avoid that. That was part and parcel of being alive at that time. So he had seen the old religion and the new religion, Then he comes across this outfit of fairly ordinary working people that had something special about them. They had some kind of special way of doing things that he'd never witnessed before. And that's why I think he already knew what it was, although we don't know when he was in the lodge. But he recognized that this group of people had something quite special. And he thought, because of their inability to record things, he thought, I've got to work out a way of making them preserve this special thing. And this is where the art of memory comes into it, of course, because he's making sure that they repeat this stuff at least once a year under pain of being fined. And he's hoping that this repetition, this constant demand that they repeat in public, well, when I say in public, within the lodge, we don't know exactly how it was done, whether it was done with just the warden or in front of all the brothers, but this constant repetition, repeating whatever it was, and I think it's the ritual, made sure that they memorized it, because they couldn't read and write, and they couldn't write it down anyway because of its esoteric content. And that's why he must have been I mean, he spent a lot of time with these people. And as I say, he had no possible connection in terms of positions in society. He had no possible connection with these people, but he wanted them to preserve. And when I say preserve, I mean memorize. He wanted them to memorize what had gone before, as the first statute lays down. And you got to remember, at that time, there was no kind of scientific method. Anything that brought you nearer to understanding the world would have been special. And they definitely had something special focused on the Old Testament, a special ceremony. We don't know what it was. And I just think he was so taken with what they were doing that he paid a lot of attention to them. And he made sure it was secret from the church. He didn't write to the guild, the labor union. He didn't write to them. He wrote to the secret organization, the lodge, because that's where it was all going on as far as he was concerned. The guild was an economic entity, more interested in wages and all that kind of stuff. The lodge didn't do anything in comparison. I mean, when you look at it, I mean, all they did was they admitted people. And yet, meeting after meeting after meeting, they're initiating people, they're having discussions, they're admitting lawyers and doctors. So there's something special. But it's, the guild isn't special, it's the lodge that's special. And he sees this. And I think, a Freemason today can understand that. I mean, I think we all love the craft. We think it's special. What happens is special. And we would not see Freemasonry disappear without a fight. I think William Shaw was the same. Don't know if that's an answer, but it's probably the best I can come up with.
He must have been a very special man, because I know between lodges, when lodges get into trouble and you talk about amalgamating them, they'll fight to the death to retain their independence. Yes. And yet he managed to take a whole series of lodges, make them agree and accept leadership, or let's say a symbolic leadership that wasn't even their own religion.
Yeah. To be fair, he did have a very powerful weapon in that he paid them. So, if they didn't do what he wanted, he could make life financially difficult. Although he doesn't, from what I know of him, he doesn't come across like that. But maybe they recognized a kindred spirit. They had somebody important at court that would defend them. So there's all these things that come into play. And I mean, he was an important individual in his own right, although I'm still puzzled as to why he was never even knighted. But he was a very important person. Next time, if I'm allowed back, I'll read you his epitaph, which gives you an impression of just how important he was. Not important, but how beloved he was to those around him. That might be my best answer for you.
Okay. Thank you very much, and I'll look forward to the biography.
All right, okay, thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And Brother Bob, you're more than welcome to start next lecture with that citing, I guess, right?
Yeah,
From his words.
I'll read that to you. It's actually quite special. I mean, I've never come across words like this before, to be honest. And I mean, I think a lot depends, and this is where ritual's important. If you believe that words themselves are important, when you link words together in a certain sequence, they get a power and a force all of their own that on their own they can't have. And that's why ritual is important for that reason. Anyway, that's just a personal.
So can I elaborate on that and say that these days virtual working was kind of discussed, and then most, if not all, GLs just said that no, it cannot be done. And when I tried to find out in different groups what was the actual reasoning why it cannot be done or why it should be done, or whichever the position the brother or initiated person had. So I heard different positions, but from this point that you made, just that it's about the words and the sequencing of the words. Do you think, again, we're not going against or anything, I'm just trying to understand better my personal, let's say, perspective on things. Do you think that we using ritual words in the said sequence, would it be ritual, or it still needs physical fellowship in one space closer, which brings us to the very question of esoteric part of it, which is unseen part of it. Is it there? I understand you're already smiling, but just elaborate on that.
Okay. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, these stonemasons, as I keep saying, weren't stupid, and they could. And this is for themselves, remember. This is not for anybody else. It's for them, just for them. So if they can create a special language, a special ceremony, a unique way of doing things that only for them and only they could understand, then that in itself is power, because it means that nobody else can be involved. No one else can judge them. No one else can say whether they're right or wrong. It's theirs. It's their language, their ritual, their ceremony, their symbols even. And so that in itself is power. What I'm sure what happened is that over time, they refined that. They found that there was a certain way of, or a certain rhythm, certain words that people would pay attention to, whereas not so much to another word. And over probably just by trial and error, they found a sequence of words that made it powerful. And that carried this esoteric message much more strongly than just saying the esoteric knowledge. Esoteric knowledge in ordinary words isn't special. It's just more words. So putting it into a special framework of words makes the esoteric knowledge special as well. So it's, yeah.
We definitely need the 5th lecture with more filter and see what was the details of the earlier, let's say, rituals, I guess.
Struggling to explain that, unfortunately, but yeah, you get the general idea.
Yeah. So, with that said, would you say that the craft is more than just moral lessons today, which is much more emphasized in today's fellowships? Whenever you meet, it's about staying on level, square and everything. Being it's kind of emphasized more moral part of it.
Yeah, and again, I mean, I'm not.
It's more than that.
But what tends to happen, and I mean, you'll probably have seen this as well, if you go to a senior Freemason or even you go to a Grand Lodge and tell me, and you ask the question, tell me what the esoteric knowledge is, then it's like, what are you talking about? So, well, you say, no, there's esoteric knowledge within the ritual. Explain it to me. Don't know what you're talking about. And that's why, I mean, I divide Freemasons into 2 classes, and sorry if I offend people with this, but you know, I'm from Scotland, so I don't care. I divide them into 2 types, you know. You've got ceremonial Masons who love to get dressed up and go around and show everybody, and I'm so-and-so and so-and-so. And then you've got the other people, other Masons, who are philosophical Masons. And we're in a situation in the modern world where the ceremonial Masons have all the power, philosophical Masons don't have any power at all. So in some ways, you have a situation where the ceremonial Masons are the government and the philosophical Masons are the religion, to put it on a kind of country level.
Thank you. I'll just have one more question, because there were some questions which we elaborated together with in the group. So it might fit into this discussion. GAO to you, Grand Architect, created the universe out of nothing, which is kind of major monotheistic religions, let's say, story, or out of something which was already present, which is more philosophical and Plato or other Greek philosophers' approach. What is your historian's perspective on this? No, I mean, having your experience here in the craft, I mean.
From a Masonic point of view?
Yeah, definitely.
Well, that's a difficult one, because all religions claim to have the answer, you know, and you know, so if you're not of that religion, then you'll never get the answer. You've got to be a member of that religion to get the real answer. I don't think Freemasonry even makes any attempt to do that.
Yeah,
what it's trying to do is it's trying to get people to think about possibilities. And of course, that's ultimately is why a lot of religions don't like us, because what we're saying is, you know, you've got to think about these things. You've got to speculate. You know, you're a speculative Mason. You've got to think for yourself and inquire and ask questions, where a lot of churches say, you don't need to ask questions. We're telling you what the truth is. So don't ask any questions at all. Just do what you're told. And that's why religions don't like us in particular, for that reason. So that's a very difficult question to answer. I think it depends on where you are, and perhaps more importantly, when you were, because when is as important as where in terms of that kind of philosophy, that kind of outlook. Yeah, I need to, that's a very philosophical question. I need to think about that.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah,
And
right.
this one would be last if nobody else says anything to add or ask. I'm just trying to go through the questions which we have prepared. So, what is there in the craft? Versus what should be there in it? Because you said that things have been changing. From this one would be from the perspective of an historian, not just a brother.
Yeah. Well,
Is contemporary? I'll just it up. Is contemporary craft missing out something? As we said last time, some things have been kind of got
yeah.
lost, sort of.
I think what's happened is human beings can't leave anything alone. They've always got to play with it. They've got to tinker with it. Sometimes they think they're making it better. Sometimes they think they're taking out mistakes that have been made, but they keep playing around with everything. They can't leave something alone. So the more people have tinkered with the ritual, say, over centuries, the more the original ritual isn't understood, especially when language changes all the time, as you know. So the language changes. So trying to understand the language of 400 years ago is difficult. And then you've got to add on all the other people adding their stuff into it in different languages at different times. So it gets very complicated trying to understand what was, and that's why I always go back to the original rituals. So at least we've got a starting point. This is the basic stuff that they originally had, and then compare it to what we've got today. And you can see there's a huge difference between the two. And you can, if you've got the time and the energy, you can start working from both ends to try and work out what has been added and what has been lost. I mean, a lot of stuff has disappeared as well. But I don't think there's ever been any kind of school or academy or university or whatever. I don't think anyone has looked at the rituals from the beginning to the end and tried to work out what all the changes have been. I don't think anyone has ever done that.
Yeah, that
Be a
could
lifetime's work, I think.
Yeah, that could be a good challenge for an
Yeah,
academician.
yeah.
That's a great one. Okay, I guess I don't see. I'll just check briefly if anybody wants to ask a question or make a final remark. This is final call. You have the opportunity to say something, whatever you want. Nope, everyone's happy. I guess that's it. Then
Okay.
I would once again thank you so much, Brother Bob, for your time. Very informative and insightful lectures and answers. And we'll be seeing you on April 21st with the next topic. Yeah, you want to change something?
That's Monday. No, that's Monday, is it? Monday? Tuesday?
No,
Monday.
it shouldn't be Monday. Just 1 second. It's Tuesday.
All right, okay.
Yeah.
Not that I'm going anywhere, I have to say, but
I guess everyone's home.
we're all stuck. That's right, we're all stuck at home, as you
Yeah.
can tell. Can't
So
get out to the barbers, you know. So the whiskers are getting longer
I
and
did it
longer.
at home. Baldy men are happy now. Just so I can confirm, right? April 21st,
Right.
same time, same everything.
Sure.
Okay, to all the participants, everything is the same. I will send the link for this recording. As agreed, this recording now will be posted to the groups because there are people who want to listen to it. And yeah, if anyone wants to share his personal email, you can use the chat next 3, 4, 5 minutes. It will be delivered to you personally. And that's it. Have a good night. Stay healthy. Keep safe. So bye-bye for now. See you on April 21st.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, have a beer on me.
Next time I'm
Bye-bye.
I'm coming to
It's going to
Scotland.
be a whiskey,
Definitely.
Bob.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Double malt.
Yeah,
Right?
I've got a bottle of something nice here. So
I'll keep the
You know,
room
Bob,
open
I was-
for next several minutes, and I'll stop now recording. So if anybody wants to just chat around, please do so.